4.5 tons of gold, silver, and jewelry, pulled from the Atlantic seabed in 1984, still locked inside a cannon. The Whydah Galley was a slave ship turned pirate flagship, sunk in a storm off Cape Cod in April 1717, and for 267 years, nobody could prove pirates were even real, not legally, not archaeologically. Then one man found a bell, one iron bell with 8 words cast into it. The Whydah Galley, 1716. That single artifact changed maritime law, rewrote piracy history, and unlocked the only confirmed pirate treasure ship ever excavated anywhere on Earth. This is the story of how a 300-ton galley became a legend, how its captain turned a slave ship into the most feared vessel in the Atlantic, and why the weapon that ultimately destroyed the Whydah was not a cannon, not a rival. It was a sandbar. Sam Bellamy captured over 50 ships in under a year, but the one prize that defined him was the ship he never intended to keep. And the single most valuable object recovered from the wreck was not gold at all. What it actually was will reframe everything you thought you knew about what pirates really wanted. She was built somewhere around 1715 to 1716 in a London shipyard, a galley frigate, roughly 100 feet stem to stern, with a deep, wide hull designed to carry both cargo and suffering. The Whydah Galley was purpose-built for the triangular trade, England to the West African coast, then across the Atlantic with enslaved people packed below, then back through the Caribbean. Her builders gave her 18 guns from the start, not because she was a warship, but because the African coast was thick with pirates, and a slow, unarmed slaver was just a gift waiting to be opened. So they built her fast. A galley frigate could use both sail and oars, which meant she could move in dead calms when heavier vessels sat helpless on flat water. She made exactly one voyage as a slaver before everything changed. A ship designed specifically to resist pirates, armed, quick, and built to absorb punishment, would become the most notorious pirate vessel in the Atlantic. The Whydah didn't drift into that fate. She was engineered for it, almost as if the shipwrights in London knew something they couldn't possibly have known. They didn't, but the ship did. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. There's a lot more story left, and it only gets stranger from here. What came before Bellamy matters, because the Whydah was already a proven hull, fast, armed, and battle-tested, before he ever set eyes on her. The man who would take her was almost her opposite. No money, no rank, no ship. He arrived in the colonies around 1715, most likely out of Devon, young, English, and reportedly trying to scrape together enough to marry a Cape Cod girl named Maria Hallett, whose family looked at him and saw exactly what he was: broke. He tried treasure salvage off the Florida coast, chasing Spanish wrecks from the 1715 Plate Fleet disaster. He found nothing worth keeping, so he went on the account: piracy. Within roughly a year, he was commanding a small fleet, and his prisoners, the people who actually met him, described a man who returned cargo he didn't need, offered his own ship to captains he'd just robbed, and delivered something close to a speech about the tyranny of merchant law. He wore his own black hair loose and unpowdered, which is where Black Sam came from, not violence, but a refusal to wear the fashionable white wig of a gentleman he had no intention of becoming. He was 26, maybe 27. He had been a pirate for less than 2 years, and he was about to acquire the most powerful ship in the Atlantic. The Whydah was on her homeward leg, gold, silver, indigo, ivory packed into her hold, when Bellamy's fleet picked her up in the Windward Passage, somewhere between Cuba and Hispaniola, in late February 1717. The chase took 3 days. Let that sit for a moment. Bellamy's sloop, the Sultana, was built for speed, and it still needed the better part of 72 hours to run the Whydah down. That single fact tells you more about the ship's construction than any description could. When Lawrence Prince finally struck his colors, there was no real battle, just the exhaustion of a chase no one could win. Bellamy's response was unusual even by the loose standards of the account. He handed Prince the Sultana, a clean trade, a working sloop for a galley frigate loaded with colonial wealth, generous enough that it reads less like piracy and more like a purchase. Then Bellamy went to work on her. He added guns until she carried 28 cannons, transforming a fast slaver into something closer to a small warship. The crew swelled to somewhere over 150 men. Why the Whydah specifically? She was already armed, she was already fast, and she had a hold deep enough to carry everything a fleet accumulates: plunder, provisions, men. He didn't just want a flagship, he wanted a mobile base. The cannons were almost secondary. What Bellamy built aboard the Whydah wasn't just a weapons platform. It was something the Atlantic had almost never seen, a ship run by its own crew. Every man who joined signed articles, written articles, agreed to collectively, spelling out shares, conduct, and rights. The captain's share of plunder was larger than a common sailor's, but not by much. The gap between Bellamy and his lowest deckhand was a fraction of what separated a Royal Navy admiral from his pressed men. A sailor aboard a merchant vessel in 1717 might earn a few shillings a week with no say over his route, his cargo, or his captain's temper. Aboard the Whydah, major decisions went to a vote. Bellamy told one captured captain, in words close enough to a recorded speech that they've survived in period accounts, that he was a free prince who bowed to no crown and no company. The man meant it structurally, not just rhetorically. And the ship behind that speech was formidable. 28 cannons on her gun deck, swivel guns mounted at the rail, short, fast, loaded with scrap metal and aimed at men, not hulls. Grenades, a crew somewhere around 150. A Royal Navy 6th rate of the same era carried roughly the same gun count. The Whydah wasn't dressed up as a warship. She simply was one, crewed by men who owned a share of her. Slave ship turned pirate flagship, smart tactical upgrade, or reckless overreach. Drop your take below. But here is what they don't tell you. 50-plus ships in under a year. No pirate of the entire Golden Age came close to that pace. Bellamy was heading north, toward Cape Cod, the Whydah riding low and heavy with the weight of everything he'd taken. And then, on the night of April 26th, the weather changed. The weather off Cape Cod that April was already wrong before dark. A nor'easter, one of those deep Atlantic storm systems that builds pressure for days before it releases, came down on the coast with almost no warning. The wind shifted hard. Visibility collapsed to nothing. The Whydah was in the shallows, riding heavy with months of accumulated plunder, when the sea state turned catastrophic. Survivor accounts describe waves breaking over the deck without pause, not spray, full water, the anchors dragging through sand, the crew unable to hold the sails in wind that strong. There was nothing to do. The shore was roughly 500 feet away, close enough that men on the beach could hear voices from the ship. She struck a sandbar. The masts came down. The hull rolled and then opened, and the Whydah, the most powerful pirate vessel in the Atlantic, broke apart in something under an hour. Of roughly 150 men aboard, 2 came out of the water alive. One was Thomas Davis, a Welsh sailor, who was later tried for piracy and acquitted. The other was John Julian, Bellamy's navigator, a Mosquito man from the Central American coast, who survived the sea and was then sold into slavery on Cape Cod. 144 men, one storm, less than 60 minutes. The Bell was still down there, 30 feet under, with all of it. 30 feet of Atlantic sand held all of it for 2.5 centuries. When archaeologists began pulling material from the wreck site, the weapons didn't come up as museum curiosities. They came up as working tools. 28 cast iron cannons, swivel guns, those short, brutal, rail-mounted pieces built to sweep a deck at close range, cutlasses, and the grenades, small iron spheres, palm-sized, packed with black powder and fitted with a short fuse. You lit it, you threw it, and you did not wait to see where it landed. The pistols are the detail that stops you cold. Hundreds recovered, many still loaded. The flintlock mechanisms are corroded but structurally intact. You can still read exactly how they were carried. Several came up with their hammers at half cock, which was the standard safe carry position. A pirate walking a deck didn't want a pistol going off against his ribs. Half cock was discipline, not caution. Then there is the bandolier, a leather shoulder strap designed to carry multiple pistols slung across the chest. It came up with pistols still attached. The leather had survived because the sand sealed it. The wear patterns on the grips and barrels are consistent with repeated heavy handling. These were not ceremonial arms. The men wearing them were armed, loaded, and ready when the nor'easter hit, and the sea took them anyway. Those loaded pistols and still-strapped bandoliers point toward something the broadside paintings get completely wrong. Every popular image of the Golden Age pirate centers on the cannon, smoke rolling off the rail, splinters, carnage. But run through Bellamy's 50-plus captures, and you find almost no broadside exchanges. Merchant captains saw a 28-gun ship bearing down under a black flag, and they struck their colors. The cannon's real job was the threat. It was a reputation you could see from 2 miles out. The actual violence, when it happened at all, was immediate and personal. Pistols across the chest, a cutlass with a blade roughly 20 inches of plain heavy iron, a boarding axe, a grenade you could palm in one hand. The weapons the Whydah gave back to us skew almost entirely toward those close quarters tools, not artillery. Hundreds of personal arms, 28 cannons that by the documentary record rarely needed to speak. There is a word for this kind of leverage. In contemporary accounts, it was simply called showing colors. The flag did the work the powder never had to. The cannon was the reputation. The pistol was the door you walked through after the merchant crew had already given up. The deadliest chapter of the Whydah's story is still ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment the storm hits. Bellamy's crew voted on every decision. Real democracy at sea, or just organized chaos? Tell me what you think. What the pistols and bandoliers couldn't survive was the ocean itself. The Whydah went down in water shallow enough that you could theoretically wade partway there, somewhere between 14 and 30 feet, depending on the sandbar. Colonial salvagers were on the site within weeks of the April 1717 sinking. They pulled up almost nothing. The problem wasn't depth, it was sand. The wreck was buried almost immediately under the shifting bottom off Wellfleet, swallowed by a coastline that moves constantly, strong currents, near-zero visibility, a seafloor that rearranges itself after every storm. The site was never truly lost. The 1717 piracy trials left court records that placed the wreck in plain language. Cape Cod residents knew a pirate ship was out there. That knowledge passed down through generations, the way local knowledge does, in taverns, in deed disputes, in the particular way people point toward the water. But knowing a thing and proving a thing are entirely different. For 267 years, the Whydah existed in two places simultaneously: in the historical record, documented and named, and under 30 feet of sand, functionally unreachable, a ghost with paperwork. And here is what no one quite says out loud. Before Barry Clifford put on a tank in 1984, there was not a single pirate artifact on Earth with a verified chain of custody. Not one. Every cutlass in every glass case came with a shrug and a story. The Whydah was different. Court documented, crew named, manifest recorded. Find her, and you don't just find gold. You prove an entire era of history actually happened. Barry Clifford had heard the story as a boy: a pirate ship, a storm, a sandbar just offshore. Most Cape Cod kids filed it alongside other local color and moved on. He didn't. By the late 1970s, he was pulling the actual documents: the 1717 Admiralty trial transcripts, contemporary Boston newspaper accounts, the sparse salvage logs left by the colonial crews who'd tried and failed. Survivor testimony from the trials placed the wreck at a specific bearing from a specific landmark on the Wellfleet shore. That gave him a search corridor, narrow enough to be useful, wide enough to take years. In 1982, he incorporated a salvage company, raised private investment, and began systematic work. The water off Wellfleet is cold enough to numb your hands in minutes, and visibility routinely drops to inches. You are feeling more than seeing. His team dragged magnetometers across the bottom, hunting the iron signature of 28 cannons buried under shifting sand. In 1984, the first concentrations came up: coins, corroded weapons, fragments of hull, enough to confirm a wreck, not enough to prove which one. Then, in July 1985, a diver's hand found something in the sand with letters cast directly into the bronze. The bell itself is not large, roughly the size of a man's torso, cast bronze rather than iron, green-black with concretion built up over 2.5 centuries. A diver brings it to the surface on July 20th, 1985, and for a moment it looks like almost anything: a lump, a crust, a guess. Then the conservators get to work. Layer by layer, the marine growth comes away, and underneath, 8 words cast directly into the metal: the Whydah Galley, 1716. That is not a label someone attached later. That is the ship announcing itself. In Federal Admiralty Court, a cast inscription on a primary vessel fitting is about as clean a chain of custody as the law allows. And Massachusetts immediately understood what it meant, because the state moved to claim the site almost before the bell was dry. Clifford spent years in litigation before the courts confirmed his salvage rights. But the legal fight, as bruising as it was, is almost secondary to what the bell actually did. Every artifact pulled from that sand before July 20th was, technically, an 18th century object of uncertain origin. After that date, every coin, every pistol, every fragment of rigging became evidence in a documented case. The bell didn't just name the ship, it authenticated everything around it. The most valuable thing on the site was never the gold. It was 8 words in bronze, sitting 30 feet down, waiting. If you were diving the Whydah wreck, what would you want to find most? The weapons, the coins, or something else entirely? What the bell authenticated was not a chest of gold. It was something stranger. Over 10,000 artifacts have come up from that sand. Coins from at least 50 different mints, Spanish pieces of 8, English shillings, Portuguese reis, West African gold dust still sealed inside small leather pouches, the way a trader would carry it on the Guinea coast. Not sorted, not organized, jumbled together the way you'd expect from 50 separate ships looted piecemeal over 18 months. Then the personal items, rings, a long gold chain, the kind worn against the skin, not locked in a box. Jewelry that was clearly on someone's body when the storm hit. Not inventory, not cargo, someone's. Then a surgeon's kit, navigational instruments, fragments of silk fabric, which in 1717 represented real money, and the weapons already described, loaded, primed, ready. What you're actually looking at is a cross-section of the entire Atlantic economy of 1717, compressed into one hull. Every major trading route that touched the ocean, the slave trade, the sugar run, the silver fleets out of Cartagena, left something in that wreck. No pirate screenplay ever wrote it this way. The gold dust in the leather pouches alone tells you more about how the Atlantic actually moved money than most textbooks do. The treasure already told us what the Whydah took. The cannons tell us how she took it and what that cost her. 28 guns came up from that sand, and they are not a matched set. English iron, Dutch bronze, Spanish cast pieces from different decades, different foundries, different continents. No Admiralty contract, no naval supply depot. Every gun on that ship was a prize, stripped from a captured vessel and bolted to her rails, which means every gun also brought its own problem, its own bore diameter, its own ball size, its own powder charge. A Dutch 4-pounder does not fire an English 4-pounder's shot cleanly. In a prolonged fight, that mattered. What you're looking at, gun by gun, is a physical manifest of the Whydah's captures. Each piece is a trophy. Each trophy is also a logistical headache. And then there is the loaded one. A single cannon recovered from the site still had its charge intact. Black powder, iron ball, 3 centuries in salt water, never fired. The nor'easter took it before anyone could pull the lanyard. That gun was aimed at something or someone that history never recorded. The shot is still inside it. The cannons and the treasure pull your eye, but the sand gave back something the artifacts couldn't prepare you for. A juvenile leg bone found near a small shoe and a pistol. Forensic analysis put the age at roughly 11 years old. 11. Someone sent a child aboard, cabin boy most likely, or a young sailor with nowhere else to go, and the nor'easter didn't distinguish. The 1717 trial records, which survive, list a crew that was visibly multiracial, African, Native American, and European names sitting in the same column of the same document. The Whydah wasn't an all-white crew of storybook buccaneers. She was a floating cross-section of the Atlantic's dispossessed. And then there is John Julian, mosquito navigator, one of only 2 men pulled alive from that beach. He knew those waters well enough to bring the Whydah north through the Caribbean, and his reward for surviving was to be sold into slavery in Massachusetts. The ship he navigated had been built to carry enslaved people. The colony that bought him had been enriched by the same trade. The circle closed on him completely. 144 men went down with her. Most of their names are gone. What remains is a leg bone, a small shoe, and a pistol lying beside it in the sand. So why did Bellamy keep her? Every earlier vessel in his fleet was nimble, lightly crewed, expendable. But the Whydah had been purpose-built on the West African coast to do one specific thing: outrun pirates. Her hull was designed for speed in exactly the waters where pirates hunted. Bellamy recognized that instantly. The same quality that made her his prey made her the finest weapon he could put under his feet. No merchant vessel afloat could chase her down. He didn't take her despite being a slave ship. He took her because she was the fastest hull in the Atlantic. And the most valuable object she carried wasn't the gold dust, wasn't the ivory, wasn't the jewelry. It was a bronze bell cast in 1716 with 8 words, the Whydah Galley, 1716. Without those 8 words, recovered from 30 feet of sand in July 1985, none of the rest had a legal identity. The bell was the only artifact that could stand in a court of law and prove which ship this was. And without that proof, the excavation had no right to exist. The gold had no right to be kept, and the history had no right to be told. That is why the Whydah remains the only confirmed pirate treasure wreck ever archaeologically excavated on Earth. Not because no other pirate ship sank. They sank by the dozen, but no other site has produced the one thing that matters in a courtroom: proof. A sandbar 500 feet from the shore of Wellfleet was the one thing Sam Bellamy could not outrun. It took him in under an hour, and then it held him for 267 years, until a bell with 8 words said, "This is real," and it was always real. The bell, 8 words. That is what 267 years of Atlantic storms could not erase, and what proved the golden age of piracy was real. If you want to go deeper, the next episode covers how pirate crews actually divided their plunder, and the math is not what the movies show. Drop a comment. Which surprised you more, that the cannon was mostly theater, or that a child's bone was found near